there's an awful lot in these opening stage directions. There's tons of signification that's going on in this initial mise en scène. So the action of the entire play takes place immediately outside the Cabot farmhouse in New England, and I think one of the key decisions to place it here is because it's, I think, associated with that kind of puritanical Calvinism, New England being a kind of, one of the historical repositories in geographic terms of very fierce, what we would call ascetic religion, the religion and the habits of religion of denial. You shouldn't have, mashed potatoes with your dinner. You should have turnips. Don't sit on a chair, sit on a spike. It's got that very the impulse of abnegation is an important part of that kind of Calvinist religious theology, and that it's that same kind of context that Emily Dickinson's poems inhabit. And you can kind of tell, Emily Dickinson's poems, whilst she hates that religion, I think they are extremely harsh in their aesthetic. Not horrible in a sort of moral sense, but they're very sort of stony. There's not an awful lot of powerful emotion. And, I don't read those poems and think, oh, yeah, I bet she's really fun when she's had a few drinks. She really loosens up and starts talking about her feelings. She's extremely icy and restrained. And I think that climate is the one of Cabot. Ephraim is of that sort of inclination. And that's where that stony Apollonian feature comes from. It's the denial of impulse, of pleasure. And that's exactly what Aschenbach suffers from in his time in Munich. It's that I'm not going to embrace anything impulsive or that gives me pleasure or that is involving a connection to an unthinking element to human behavior, and that's why it's set where it is. It's in the year 1850, which is also prior to the peak of the gold rush, and this is an important sort of fact. It's prior to the peak of the gold rush, so that motif of the brothers constantly going over our hills to claim their gold is something that actually is a moment of dramatic irony with the audience. The audience knows that most of the people that ended up going over there to try and claim gold ended up flat broke and abject. And so we see that those two contextual features, the religion of New England and its Calvinistic Puritanism, and then the covetous materialism of the gold rush. There couldn't be a more materialistic sort of historical moment where people are just sifting the ground for rock solid lumps of money. It nakedly exposes that materialism. Those two things are what this play, I think, is attempting to attack. Greedy, stony-hearted materialism and religion. That's what it's after. And it doesn't necessarily say that anything that opposes that is wonderful, because I don't think it's a sort of straightforward, isn't, Aben a really nice kid? He's not. He's a little shit, really. He's horrible. He's a nasty little piece of work. But his impulsive behavior is an important sort of counterweight to this sort of stony, restrained denialism that I think Ephraim represents. So the south end of the house faces its front to a stone wall. So we have this, the stones at the front of this set. And remember me showing you that image of that setting decision where the whole of the back of the stage is big boulders. Those stones are one of those twin symbols that define this play. They are the Apollonian symbols. They are the symbols of self-restraint, of suffering, of thinking that God's in them there stones, that I'm going to extract salvation from this difficult, lot of horny-handed manual labor that Ephraim sort of believes in. So the house faces this giant stone wall, and it is a symbol of all of those features of denial, but also of his controlling sort of repression of his family. The set is completely surrounded by these stones. The house is in good condition but in need of paint, and its walls are sickly greyish. So there's this sign of poor health, and the green of the shutters is faded. So there's this sort of lost vitality. There's this lost life, I think, that this stony denial that Ephraim represents has caused in the house itself. And then it's its binary symbol, its opposite. The two enormous elms are on each side of the house. So they become these kind of paradoxical opposites of the stones themselves, and aren't necessarily good. It's not that stones are bad, these elms are good, and that these elms represent vitality and everything that's wonderful about life. It's purely that they represent the complete opposite. They represent unmitigated sort of vitality and power, and are inevitably associated with the maternal. So they have this sort of family force and become an overwhelming symbol of maternal and feminine drive, I think, in the play. And so you have these two, immediately in this opening mise-en-scène and stage directions, you're given this huge sense of conflicting impulses, that the characters are going to be dropped with it. Here are these two dramatic competing forces, boom, and we're going to drop these characters in the middle of this conflict and work out that, they're going to try and have to navigate some way of extricating themselves from this sort of competing dynamic between the two of them. The elms are often, not just in this play, but in terms of literary symbolism generally, they are often seen as a symbol of family, of family force and revenge. So although that they are associated with feminine vitality, they are also associated with a vengeful kind of family connection. That you've wronged the family, and therefore the family is going to, it sounds like the mafia, the family is going to come back to get you because of its deep-seated, powerful vengeance. So yes, they are vital, and yes, they're feminine, but they're also extremely protective and vengeful. There's an enormous sense of hatred and hostility that is residual. Yeah, he is deeply connected to this symbol. Because they represent Ma. They represent, her being wronged by Ephraim and her being almost killed by her wrongful, sort of stony suffering. Ephraim basically puts Ma through a life of commitment to the stones. And she obviously was not meant for that type of existence and ends up dying through suffering, basically. And so the elms, I think, are the conduit, the sort of the mode of communication between her and her sense of vengeance and the family as it exists now, particularly through Aben. Aben is the receptacle for all of this sort of maternal vengeance and hostility. They appear to protect and at the same time subdue. So that sort of paradoxical feature of them seeming to be both simultaneously threatening and protective, I think, shows you that their relationship to Aben, that they represent his missing mother. And that she, as much as she wants to protect him, she is also seeking to subdue the aspects of life on the farm that Ephraim represents, this sort of suffering dedication to making life more difficult for himself than it needs to be. There is a sinister maternity in their aspect, a crushing, jealous absorption. I mean, I don't really know what that means, if I'm being perfectly honest. If someone said to me, what does that look like? I don't know what a tree that has a sinister maternity looks like, and a crushing, jealous absorption. But what is being made, nakedly obvious to us here is their gendered symbolic significance, that they represent the Dionysian, they represent the feminine, they represent vitality, but they also represent powerful revenge. That this Apollonian lifestyle that Ephraim has committed to is going to get its comeuppance, and it's going to be at the force of a maternal sort of Dionysian, a feminized Dionysian.
If you're watching this play, how would you know that they represent?
Exactly. That's precisely what I look at that and think. If I was the stage director here and I was doing the set, what would you think about this, Julia? How would you paint that? A tree with a sinister maternity in their aspect. I have no idea what do you paint a tree with breasts and because he explicitly makes this point further down.
The branches that look like hands.
Yeah, I think that's partly the key thing I get from that is that sense of suffocation, that it's hanging over the building and it is determining the fate of the characters in this scene. So at the same time, it has this crushing, jealous absorption, whatever the hell that means. I think it means it's extrapolating the house itself. It's almost taking the house itself and making it a part of itself. It's sort of like I don't want to sound too zinzy here, but it's sort of like a macrophage or something. It's like digesting it and taking it apart. They've developed from their intimate contact with the life of the man of the house an appalling humaneness. So they've almost taken on this kind of, they appear to be equality personified. They appear to be a character almost in the play. You know, they are that vital. So they have been brought to life by their contact with the life of the man in the house. So their hostility to him has, I think, animated them. Their purpose in terms of their existence is to deal with Ephraim. They brood oppressively over the house. So they have this enormous control over what's going on in the scene itself. And they're like exhausted women resting their sagging breasts and hands and hair on its root. And when it rains, their tears trickle down monotonously and rot the shingles. You know, this is extremely poetic, this description, but that both that same sense of domineering control and an attempt to destroy whatever this house represents. This house effectively represents something that shouldn't be there according to the rules of natural vitality, you know. And Ephraim is very explicit about this, you know, of saying that God's in them dire stones, that actually his salvation is contingent upon him making his life difficult for himself and rearing up this ranch out of this unlikely stony terrain. And that actually the forces of vitality seem to be saying to us here, well, it's unnatural. Why is it even here in the first place? You know, it shouldn't be here. He has, because it has caused him to lead an unfulfilling life. His unfulfilling life is ultimately what has been channeled into the stony ranch that shouldn't really exist. And so this maternal force of vitality seems to be intent on returning it to the status quo, of leveling it to the ground and showing you that sort of vain, egotistical way of living that's based on a denial of your own impulses and a distance and a sense of alienation to all of those that surround you is ultimately an unnatural way of living, and that natural force is at the end going to win. And that's where its tears trickle down monotonously and rot the shingles. It's sadness at this state of affairs. It's sadness at the artificial creation that Ephraim has managed to sort of erect in the stones is ultimately rotting it slowly. So it's dissatisfaction with this whole way of life that's based on denial, that's based on puritanical religious conviction, that's based on materialism. Yeah, I think that there's the power here, though, the power in this play, I think, is more in line with the things that are positive. The power is in line with those of us that are domineering, the forces of good status quo. You know, that there's some sense of, I think, the right side of the equation in this play. It's not quite that simple, but it's more, you know, when you look at O'Neill's description of this play, it's very clear that most of his ire and his anger is directed at Ephraim. You know, Ephraim is the one that he's gunning down with this play and everything that he represents. I think partly because of his own daddy issues, he you know, resents this sort of domineering paternal figure. The overall appearance of the house itself is kind of secondary to the twin symbols. So if you look just at the, you know, you can just see from my annotations that suddenly we have a description of the house itself and all of this annotation to do with the symbols that define the scene. So the house itself is described here. All of this is about these two symbols, the stones and the wall that's made from them, and then these two trees that overbear on the house. The house itself is described in fairly plain terms, and I think it's very deliberate that we have this, you know, the path running around the gate to the right corner of the house and the front door, and this is much more conventional series of stage directions that's quite prosaic in its qualities. You know, it's reliable, concrete details. This is what the house looks like. But what we get here is the sense that this house is being sort of dropped in the middle of these two aggressively competing forces that are represented by those two symbols. And that the drama in the play is going to come from the competition between these two forces that are actually bigger than any of the individual characters. You know, Ephraim most closely associates himself with the stones and the Apollonian denialism that I think the stones represents. And Aben, I think, is most closely associated with the elms. But Abby then becomes associated with the elms, and their relationship becomes a way, you know, the communication of this maternal vitality is carried out through their connection. You know, that's why it ends up being so powerful, because it's not really about them as individual human beings. It is about them as the vehicles for this powerful force that's beyond their control. So,
What is the overall
The overall appearance of the house itself is secondary to the twin symbols. The symbols themselves are what O'Neill spends all the time in this opening giving us and explaining to us. This is true. Now, all I've got here are the connections between the characters and the mythological stories that he rewrites here, the Medea myth, the Oedipus myth, and the Hippolytus story. That Abby, I think, according to whichever myth you're seeing being rewritten here, is either the Phaedra or Jocasta in Oedipus the King. The key thing about this play is it isn't a rewriting of any one of them. It kind of blends all the elements together, and so I think creates this enormous sense of timeless conflict by doing so. By deliberately alluding to those Greek tragedies, it gives us this impression of, well, these things have never gone away. They were there all these thousands of years ago when the Greeks were writing drama. Here they are on a farm in New England in 1850, those same deep-seated human drives and impulses. And that's why I think you get the impression in this play that each of these characters is sort of flailing around, dealing with forces that are so much more powerful than each one of them as individuals. There is an enormous sense of each of these characters. I just think of these characters like little bits of flotsam and jetsam in the sea floating around, on the tide of each of these dramatic forces that are completely dominating what they do and how they behave. That's part of, I think, the tragic aesthetic, is this sense of sort of disempowering the individuals with a sense of deterministic fatalism. That the individuals in these plays are not in control of their own actions. I think part of Pinter's aesthetic is to very deliberately show you that actually people are in control of their actions. They don't realize how much of what is going on around them, but they have a conscious ability, like P.T., at some point, to act of their own accord and to control their destiny to a certain extent. It's a compromised version of that, but there is a sense of control here. The reason I think this play shares so much with Streetcar is that the whole title of Streetcar is about that powerful sexual impulsive desire that compels people to act in a certain way that's beyond their own kind of rational and conscious understanding. And that I also think is the reason why this play is about, is titled Desire Under the Elms. It's this, in both plays, lots of the behavior and interaction between the characters is deterministic. It's forced by forces that are beyond the rational control of each of the individual characters. So that this, I think, shares a lot more in common with Streetcar than it does with The Birthday Party. It's sunset of a day at the beginning of summer in 1850, so there's this sort of, it is a moment of new beginnings, so to speak, in terms of the setting. There's no wind and everything is still, and there's that moment of peaceful tranquility that is completely at odds with the dramatic conflict that goes on in the scene. But the sky in this symbol, in this play, I think, is the third of the three central symbols. There's the elms and the stones that are constantly sort of at forces and at odds with each other. And then the sky is this transcendental symbol, I think, of evading the conflict between those two forces. And I think of that in a kind of Freudian conceptualization. The sky really is the kind of ego, the thing that allows you to reconcile the competing drama of the superego and the id. And I think there's an element of that structure in the symbolism in this play, that the sky is the leveling voice, the moderating influence, the source of transcendence away from this conflict, away from this maelstrom of hostility between maternal vitality and sort of a kind of masculinized sense of restraint. Those two forces are constantly at odds with each other through the characters in the play, but the sky is constantly where the characters look up to, almost with a sense of longing, of trying to navigate their way out of that dramatic conflict. And I think the fact that it's suffused with deep colours, I think, gives us this sense of it being having this ability to reconcile these dramatic impulses. The green of the elms glows, but the house is in shadow, seemingly pale and washed out by contrast. So the contrast in the colours of the elms themselves and that washed out absence of vitality in the house, I think, shows you that drama. The sky is blended with colours, and then the elms themselves are deeply empowered with this vital green. The house is sort of waning from its own lack of vitality. So you can see just in the symbolism of the colours here, that whole sort of Nietzschean conception of the Dionysian and the Apollonian, of the house itself being this sort of Apollonian symbol, drained of the Dionysian animating effect of vitality, but the elms being basically an aggressive excess of that, an excessive destructive force that's sapping the life, I think, out of the house itself. The door opens and Aben comes into the scene, and his characterization is important here. He has a large bell in his hand, and he swings mechanically, awakening a deafening clangor. And I think here, his actions are quite inhumane. He is the disturber of this opening tranquility. And his disturbance of this quiet shows us that he's going to be a kind of precipitating, dramatic protagonist. I am going to take this serenity and disrupt it very, very deliberately. He puts his hands on his hips and stares up at the sky again. He's the one that invokes this longing, this sense of longing to reconcile these competing impulses. He sighs, and of course he genetically represents these two impulses as well. He is 50% Ephraim, 50% Mar. He is the site of conflict between these two impulses, both in a literal genetic sense and also in a symbolic sense. He is the battleground for these two impulses to play out. He sighs with a puzzled awe and blurts out with halting appreciation. He's determined by forces beyond his control. I think you get that sense here when he sighs with a puzzled awe. He looks up above himself and is awed and at the same time confused. He's got this great sense of being driven, I think, by things that are not within his full conscious control. And blurts out with halting appreciation, I think, God, Purdy. And this sense of tranquility that he looks at is sort of lost on him in a little way. He appreciates its beauty, but understands that his position is almost to disrupt this sense of tranquility. So we have this very deliberate construction of a moment of calm before the storm, I think, of a real sense of powerful tranquility that we've given Aben as the sort of precipitating force, the disruptor of that. But I think there is in his character a longing for resolution. And you can tell, in O'Neill's aesthetic, that nearly all of this is stage direction. There's one line here, and all of the rest of this is stage directions. He stares about him frowningly. So there's, I think, some sense of discomfort for him in these surroundings. He is at odds with the surroundings, and that, I think, invites a comparison with Blanche. She feels completely idiosyncratic and alienated in the surroundings that she finds herself in the opening of the play. His face is well-formed, good-looking, but its expression is resentful and defensive. So he embodies this sort of sense of, well, we know that it's not a coincidence that he's sexually attractive. He is going to ally himself with the sexual forces of the elms. But he is resentful and defensive. There's the Ephraim in him. He is extremely hostile towards others and very, very defensive. He's not good at connecting with other people. And so even though we kind of look at him and we associate him with the elms a lot more than we associate him with the stones, one of the ironies of the play is that he's got a lot more of his dad in him than he realizes. He's got a lot more of Ephraim in him than he's willing to admit, because he consciously identifies with his mother and that maternal vitality. But you can see it just there. He's resentful and defensive at the same time as being associated with the vitality of sexuality. His defiant dark eyes remind one of a wild animal's in captivity. He's got this repressed animalistic dynamism that, again, carries with it all that sense of danger and hostility. So he has, again, that oppositional quality of animal vitality, but also of possible vengeance. Yeah, he has this sense of possible vengeance, that he is like Stanley, this kind of brutalistic, natural, impulsive force, and angry and resentful about his own being kind of hemmed in. Each day is a cage in which he finds himself trapped, but inwardly unsubdued. And there's that description of him. His entire life is an act of repression. His animal vitality and the connection that he has to that maternal Dionysian impulse is trapped within a repressive Apollonian existence. He's going to work on think about this really, free from all this sort of poetic terminology. He's working on a field every single day from the crack of dawn until the moment the sun goes down, and living with very simple, basic brothers who have no interest in really anything other than gaining some money and paying lip service to religion. So this whole life for a character like him is extremely repressive. And there is a fierce, repressed vitality about him. O'Neill makes this extremely evident here. And that associates, I think, this repressed vitality is that maternal force waiting to express itself. So you can see how his identity is the battleground for these competing impulses. He is the individual who these forces are going to kind of try and compete for, the fate of his character. He has black hair, mustache, and thin curly trace of beard. He's dressed in rough farm clothes and he spits on the ground with intense disgust. So he, again, his association with this labouring life that he leads is one that he's not happy with. And you can see that through his costume and his sense of disdainful disregard for the surroundings that he finds himself in. He turns and goes back into the house, and Simeon and Peter come in from their work in the fields. So here, he I think, is very deliberately separated from his brothers. You know, his brothers are almost, they're able to reconcile themselves to this Apollonian existence because they're animalized. They're given the, you know, the sense that they aren't actually full human beings, that they're these simple kind of materialistic creatures that have been able to make their peace with this existence because they don't have any greater sense beyond that of needing to live in a way that's satisfying. And they're deliberately animalized here. They're built on a squarer, simpler model, fleshier in body, more bovine and homelier in face. You know, they're described as if they're cows. And the way that they move around and the way that they talk is supposed to kind of overtly sort of animalize them. They're meant to seem like these kind of big laboring pack animals, you know, like cart horses or cows or something. It says they're shrewder and more practical. You know, they're a lot more adept at living in this particular way than Aben is. Aben is explicitly feminized in a way that suggests that he's at odds with this practical laboring lifestyle.
You could link this to the adaptability in the streetcar.
Yeah, absolutely. Aben is completely at odds with this type of life and actually has to go about trying to destroy it in order to live in it. So he has a lot more power than Blanche does, though, in Streetcar. That's the key difference, I think. He has, not because it's resident within himself, but because he happens to be on the side of the forces of fate, whereas Blanche is very clearly on the side that's suffering. You know, she's on the losing side of fate. He's on some form of winner here, but it's a compromised form of victory. They clump heavily along in their clumsy, thick-soled boots caked with earth. They are creatures of the soil. You know, they are part and parcel of the farm, these brothers. You know, they are cows, basically. You know, they're cows in all but name. Their clothes, their faces, hands, bare arms and throats are earth-stained. They smell of earth. You know, they are at one with this labouring manual existence on the farm. They stand together for a moment in front of the house, and as if with one impulse, they stare dumbly up at the sky. So they're here again. The way that they are almost conflated together, the boundaries between the two of them are shut down. They become this sort of singular organism almost that borrows a single brain between the two of them. You know, they are very simplistic. They have no individuation. They have no ability to think for themselves and to be individuals. And they stare dumbly up at the sky. I think there's a deliberate contrast with Aben there. Aben stares up at that sky and sees a sense of transcendental tranquility that he longs for. These guys just look at it with no real connection, you know. But ultimately, what they say is the same thing. So there's an enormous amount going on that isn't on the level of language here, which is, I think, you know, a potential connection with the birthday party, is that all of this is stage direction. All of this is telling us the difference between the characters through the stage directions. And it's actually requiring an awful lot from a pair of actors. You know, how you communicate all this as an actor with these two lines is extremely difficult. And they're grudgingly celebratory of the scene in a way that's different from Aben. Aben is in awe when he says, "God, it's purty." He's sort of grudgingly saying, "Oh, well, it's kind of nice, I guess, if I have to say something positive about it." And so I think this sort of distant relationship with beauty, I think, offers a connection with Stanley and the other men in Streetcar. There's this sort of perfunctory masculinity that Simeon and Peter represent. And Aben very deliberately is a contrast to this. This phrase I can't I can't bear to keep saying it's going to drive me crazy. Ah, yeah, it makes him sound like some kind of weird beginning of a strange song or something. Suddenly, 18 years ago, they talk here about the farm itself. What? Jen, my woman, she died. I've forgot. So there's this sort of disconnection here to emotional intensity in the two of the characters. You know, they're talking about a wife that they previously had, or at least a romantic relationship, and the other one has just completely forgotten that she existed. But the fact that they draw attention to this, I think, shows that on some level they're aware of the connection between nature and sexuality. You know, they've looked at the sky and made this connection to their own romantic life. And I think that shows us that that's what we're about to see in the play. We're about to see a play that is about that sexuality as the means through which natural vitality expresses itself. He says, I recollect now and again, make it lonesome. Christ. There's also a sort of facility for connecting to others that's lost by time or by the farm. So we see here Simeon's lonesome quality. You know, that he remembers this connection with another human being that makes him feel lonesome in the present, shows us that this ability to connect with others has been lost. And that actually it's that style of existence that Ephraim has demanded from them that's created that sense of isolation and alienation. He here moves into a little bit of figurative language. He becomes poetic. I don't know that necessarily you'd feel particularly flattered by this. She'd hair long as a horse's tail and yellow like gold. You know, he uses two similes to describe this previous relationship and this previous romantic connection that he had with this character. But that figurative language is about femininity and the connection between femininity and nature. And so it's not a coincidence that he feels distant from this. He's lived with Ephraim so long that he now is unable to connect with the feminine and with the natural and with the vital. And he has lived this kind of life of Apollonian denial. Peter gets over it pretty quickly. Wow, she's gone. And this is with indifferent finality. Then after a pause, there's gold in the West, Sim. It's like, forget about it, sunshine. We're off to go make money. You know, he's completely disconnected from the emotive qualities of this recollection and shows us really his central concern is covetous materialism. And this is where that indifferent finality comes from. He's uninterested in this recollection of his brothers. You know, get over it, mate. There's money to be made. So he has this kind of cold quality that I think is sort of missing from from Aben. He's this cold focus on money and wealth here. Simeon says, still under the influence of the sunset vaguely. In the sky. So this vague sense of connection to the sunset, I think, gives us this sense, I think, of Simeon having at least a residual capacity for appreciation of beauty, for vitality, for life itself. And that actually Peter is the one that's only completely disconnected from it at this moment in time. Peter says, wow, in a manner of speaking, that's the promise. Gold in the sky and the West Golden Gate, California, Golden West, fields of gold. So there's this, you know, obsessive vision here that I think creates this paradox in the play that we have fields of gold. This language, I think, captures that tension between the stones and their materialism and nature and its association with maternal vitality. That paradox there is the paradoxical belief that Ephraim has committed to throughout his life, and that these boys, we're going to call them, but for want of a better word, middle-aged cows.
So it's a paradox because there's not actually...
No, exactly. There aren't... And their mistaken way of thinking is that they can tame nature to satisfy their materialistic desires. And those two things are very deliberately presented in this opening as being competing impulses that are at odds with one another. You know, the natural vitality of the elms and the stony sort of sacrifice of religious denial and materialism.
Then why does he say in California?
Because they keep thinking that they're going to go off to the West and find gold to get away from their father. You know, that's the dream that they have. Because that's where the gold rush was taking place at the time. So Simeon, excited in his turn, says, fortunes laying just atop of the ground, waiting to be picked. Solomon's mines, they says, for a moment they continue looking up the sky, then their eyes drop. So there's this again, he continues with this sort of extended metaphor of sort of plucking money out of the soil that is a characteristic of their problematic vision. That they both of them here have this vision of confusing natural vitality with materialism. You know, they blend the two together, and this play very deliberately goes about showing us the separation of the two of them. You know, this play's action aggressively separates natural vitality from materialism and religion. You know, those two things are very deliberately sort of torn asunder by the events of the play. But here they kind of come back to reality. Their eyes drop and they're back in their oppressive little stony ranch. So Peter, with sardonic bitterness, says, "Here is stones atop of the ground, stones atop stones, making stone walls, year atop a year, him and you and me and the neighbour making stone walls for him to fence us in." So the stones here are being very deliberately articulated as this symbol of repressive control. You know, that they are a metaphor, I think, at this moment in time for containment and repression. That it's and I think the repetition, the redundancy actually of these repetitions actually carries out this sense of the stones themselves being this pointless labour that just keeps them trapped on the ranch and controls their destiny. Stones atop of stones making stone walls. You know, this endless labour that is to create a sense of definitive control, marking out of territory, and of repressing these sons of his. We've worked, give our strength, give our years, ploughed them under the ground. So he thinks here almost as if these human beings have been like kind of fertilizers for the soil. They have drained their vitality into the ground itself, and that's what's sort of been able to rear this ranch out of the soil. Rotten, making soil for his crops, you know, as if they themselves have rotted as individuals to make the ranch fertile. While the farm pays good for hereabouts, Peter says, if we ploughed in California, there'd be lumps of gold in the furrow. So again, he shows us this sense of, well, at least we'd be rewarded with money for all of our labour. And it shows us, I think, the limitation of their understanding of reality here. Peter, after a pause, says, though, "'Twould be hard for me, too, to give up what we've earned here by our sweat." So they think that they have some claim over the farm purely because of the labour that they've channeled into it and the effort that they've put into controlling this particular ranch. But of course, Ephraim does not see it that way.
But could also their primitive language link to the kind of their representation of like the dumb American who believes that the American dream is completely true?
I don't necessarily think their language, because the language that they use, all the characters in this play kind of use, you know, there's not necessarily a sort of register of hierarchy through linguistic register in this play in the way that there is in Streetcar. You know, Streetcar has these very different linguistic registers that mark out socioeconomic class and mark out the differences in vision between particularly Stanley and Blanche. Here, they all have this fairly coarse, colloquial language that I think part of the aesthetic of this play is about providing moments of poetic beauty within this sort of rough vernacular. You know, that's part of the aesthetic, and I think it's part of the plot of the play as well, that we're going to situate this play in this very rough, coarse, unyielding environment, but we're going to show you that environment is suitable for the kind of emotive and poetic power of Greek tragedy itself. So there's that enormous emotive communication that's going on through those, through the aesthetic of the play and the language that he uses. They talk here about Ephraim dying. Again, there it is. Maybe he'll die soon. And Peter doubtfully says, maybe. Maybe, for all we know, he's dead now. You'd need proof he's been gone 2 months with no word. There is an enormous sense, I think, of Ephraim as this sort of powerful force that controls their lives. That they just don't think he'll ever die. He almost has this quality of immortality here. You know, that he's this sort of immortal, powerful individual that they doubt even would be able to die at any point anyway. He's been gone with 2 months with no word. I think you see the sterility and distance of their relationships here. Their father has left them for 2 months and hasn't really told them where he's going and why, and communicated to them any sense of returning. You know, there's this enormous sense of distance and alienation in their connection here. He tells us he's left us in the fields an evening like this, hitched up and druv off into the west. That's plumb unnatural. He ain't never been off this farm setting to the village in 30 year or more, not since he married Aben's ma. So I think importantly here, it shows us this singular obsession with the farm that he has. He hasn't left the farm in 30 years other than to just go and find someone to basically mate with, to create heirs, to control the farm. You know, the farm is the sum total of his interest and his dedication in life. So his obsession, I think, his singular obsession with the farm is evident here. But here I think it also shows that his only reasons for leaving have been, I think, poor attempts to deal with his loneliness. He is this rigidly isolated character, and this is what O'Neill says this play is about. You know, what happens, how this obsession with an aggressively suspicious and hostile religion and an obsession with money ultimately creates a miserable, lonely life. And that's what Ephraim represents. He represents that miserable, lonely life that O'Neill believed, that this sort of denial, this self-abnegation that is the fundamental kind of feature of puritanical Calvinism and an obsession with money would create in someone's life. Simeon later down says, he skinned him too slick. He got the best of all on him. So he talks here about his actual material power. You know, he's skinned them too slick. They use this sort of natural language of agricultural labour as if he's skinning animals. But he's talking about, you know, the courts. He's too powerful and clever for the courts, and he's got the best on all of them. He is this materially powerful man because he's able to manipulate even the law of the place in which he finds himself. But again, you can see that association between him and Stanley Kowalski, you know, that grappling with the law as the means by which power is achieved, that I think invites a comparison between Ephraim and Stanley. Aben, though, enters the scene with a sardonic chuckle and uses this language of official speak, honor thy father. You know, it's a religious commandment. And that, I think, shows his intense hostility through the ironic use of the commandments here, you know, honor thy father and thy mother. I think, actually, that's a line that Goldberg says in the play, in the birthday party, you know, honor thy father all along the line. You know, it shows you that they're taking this language of the orthodox institutions of power and exposing it for the hollow discourse that it is, that it allows manipulative individuals like Ephraim to justify their behavior with the basis of religion and with the basis of the law, you know, and he shows his sense of hostility to that man-made sense of power, because he is sided with a much more naturalistic, vital connection to maternal power that he ultimately thinks, I think, is superior to this version of human man-made power. He grins and then scowls. I pray that he's died. So here, there's this sort of mixture of happiness and hostility that is evident in this phrase. I think he grins because he senses this sort of opportunistic moment for him to take control of the ranch. But then he prays that he's died. He uses this language of religion and theology to actually, that's fine, to invoke this desire to treat him with hostility. You know, he uses his language that he's been brought up with, of Ephraim, against him, you know, to wish death on him, to be sinful. Simeon and Peter sort of register that this is a sort of an unhappy fact, you know, because if anything, they're hostile towards him, but they are also ultimately little orthodox sheep at heart. You know, they just follow what they're told, really, and they know that he's using this sort of blasphemous language here, and so they together go, hey, you know, I suppose that's a moment of protest. But Aben's still gazing up at the sky and says, sun down and purdy. So you see, I think Aben is connected to vitality of nature and longs for the sense of tranquility. At this moment in time, though, they're allying themselves with both religion and, I think, greed. So that, you know, Simeon and Peter are much closer to Ephraim's values than Aben, who here constantly keeps looking at the sky as a source of this natural vitality. And then Aben says, and stares at them indifferently for a second when they later on mention California. he's much more interested in the farm itself. And this is where the central irony of the play comes in here, is that Simeon and Peter have their father's materialism, but what they don't have is any connection to the farm itself and a desire to control its destiny. Aben does. And that's where he is indifferent about their promise of wealth in California. He doesn't really care, because he cares about the farm and his ability to control it through his connection to his maternal past and his mother. Simeon, startled, smacks his lip. I am hungry. Whatever that means. I am hungry, I presume. I smells bacon. Bacon's good. So there's, I think, again, this sort of impulsive, animalistic quality to their behavior that casts Aben as a kind of a superior in terms of intellect. That at this moment in time, he's constantly being figured here as this, these guys as figured these kind of animalistic, impulsive creatures, unthinking, impulsive creatures, and that Aben is the one that's presented here as the one that's sort of superior in terms of their mind.
Isn't that comparable to Meg in the birthday party as she doesn't self-reflect?
Absolutely. You know, these guys are lacking in the intellectual faculties to sort of understand their position in a drama and a sense of conflict that's bigger than themselves. And their description here captures that, their final stage directions. They turn shouldering each other, their bodies bumping and rubbing together as they hurry clumsily to their food, like two friendly oxen towards their evening meal. You know, they look two little cows banging into each other. Moo, time for bacon. You know, they're really overtly turned into these, again, like Meg, these sort of impulsive, almost subhuman. There's something quite sinister, I think, about the way that O'Neill sort of dehumanizes them. You know, he associates that their concerns, that sort of materialism of their concerns, with something subhuman. You know, they aren't fully rounded human beings. And then the curtain falls as they disappear in the right corner of the house and can be heard entering the door. So what we have then, I think, very, very clearly in this opening scene is how much at odds Aben is with both his surroundings and his family. That is what I think is most striking about this opening stagecraft, is his enormous sense of almost kind of irritable, dynamic vitality. He is a sort of repressed soul. He's got a lot to offer in terms of passion and intensity and emotional connection. But absolutely none of it is really being expressed in a healthy way, because he's being forced to live a life of denial and suffering, I think. And being forced to live it in complete sort of intellectual and emotional isolation by being surrounded by these subhuman brothers of his. So the colour fades from the sky at the beginning of scene 2 as twilight begins, and I think there's that loss of connection from the sky which signals the play's sort of descent into the forces of conflict. If we see the sky as this sort of this symbol of the transcendent, the ability to transcend ourselves from these impulses of conflict that are represented by the symbols of the stones and the elms. The sky itself is the source of this resolution and reconciliation, but it starts to disappear from the stagecraft. And I think that's signaling to us that we're about to descend into the deep, conflicted drama of human existence. The parsimony and simplicity of the scene, I think, reflects Ephraim's kind of denial and I think obsession with money. A pine table is in the center, a cook stove in the right corner, 4 rough wooden chairs, and a tallow candle on the table. And you think of the stage directions in Desire Under the Elms, how they seem to sort of oscillate between something that you might hear in The Birthday Party and Streetcar. You know, like this, the setting of the house sounds kind of like Pinter. You know, here's a table, it's chairs. There's a few more adjectives maybe than you would find in a Pinter stage direction, but that is extremely restrained, but that's on purpose. That's to show us how tight basically Ephraim is, how stingy he is with money, how parsimonious he is, if you want to use a fancy word. How much he sees his home as just this kind of functional location. that you live and sleep in, but really it's for the purpose of working on the ranch. And then you have those moments like where he deals with the symbols, which sound like Tennessee Williams stage directions, these extremely lyrical, expressive moments of stagecraft that tell you all of the kind of figurative connotations of the features of the stage. In the middle of the rear wall is fastened a big advertising poster with a ship in full sail and the word California in big letters, which again shows us the desire for wealth of Simeon and Peter. And I think, if you consider the names of those characters, those sort of apostolic religious names that they both have from the Bible, and their association with materialism, I think tells you about, in O'Neill's mind, that he sees these two phenomena as part and parcel of the same thing, that actually obsessing about money distances you from your human vitality. Obsessing about religious conduct distances you from your human vitality, and that in his head they are all of a piece with each other. They are all part and parcel of the same human phenomenon that results in human alienation and repressed, unfulfilled lives. Kitchen utensils hang from the nails. Everything is neat and in order, but the atmosphere is of a men's camp rather than a kitchen and rather than that of a home. So again, there's this sense of this very deliberately functional. It's very cold and clinical, and it's in the image of a frame. But also, importantly, there's an absence of a maternal force here. This is a very essentializing play in terms of gender. This play borrows very stereotypical visions of essential gender difference, I think, to make sense of itself. I don't think it is hugely about gender. I mean, that's a kind of controversial statement because one of the central symbols in the play is a gendered one. But I think much more than anything, it is about what O'Neill associates gender with beyond that. I think it's a fairly simplistic, reductive vision of femininity, but unusually, it does grant it the power. This play does grant femininity a lot of power, a lot of vengeful, aggressive power that it doesn't. There's not in Streetcar, for example. Femininity is very deliberately constructed in this sort of victimized, passive role in Streetcar, whereas here it is the driving, hostile force in the play. But the fact that it also gives no sense of a home here, I think shows us there's no sense of affection or a willingness to look at things from an aesthetic point of view, or to think of the need for warmth or emotional connection here. This is a functional little men's camp. It reminds me of my friends' houses at university. These kind of where they didn't even bother to pretend that they lived in a house. It was just like tins of beans. They would always have a giant TV, and then just beer everywhere. It's horrible, that kind of. Whenever I'd stay with them, I'd be like, I want to go home. This is awful. This is horrible. And this is what happens often if you leave men to just sort of attend to their own sort of domestic duties, which is, this is as much of an excuse as it is an explanation. There's this kind of, oh no, I can't possibly. But on the whole, I would say they're not so good at that kind of thing. The three eat in silence for a moment. You can imagine these human cows sort of grazing in silence at this breakfast table, as the two elder, as naturally unrestrained as beasts of the field, they're chewing away on their breakfast without speaking to each other. And the fact that Aben is picking at his food without appetite, glancing at them with a tolerant dislike, shows us the contrast between the two of them, that they are these sort of functional individuals that have made their peace with this sort of repressive lifestyle that they've had to live as just labouring forces. And I think it shows us his inability to do so. So their sort of dysfunctional relationship shows us the connection with Aben's sort of conflicted, tense feeling of idiosyncrasy. He does not belong in this surrounding. Those two have made their peace with it, but Aben is unhappy here. He feels tense. He can't eat his food. He is like Blanche when she arrives in New Orleans. He is at odds. He is a fish out of water. He does not feel at one with this place, and his irritable sort of tension is a way of, I think, that O'Neill expresses this. So Simeon says, "Looky here, you oughtn't to have said that, Aben. They're still talking about him wishing death on a frame. It twant righteous." So again, these guys have this sort of uncritical adoption of Ephraim's sort of sanctimonious religious language. Aben doesn't even really know what they're talking about, because remember, this was a couple of hours ago that they had this conversation, and they haven't spoken about it since. "You prayed he died." And then Aben says, "Well, don't you pray it?" He's our Paul, not mine. So there's, I think, this sense of hypocrisy that Aben identifies in their conduct here. They've done nothing but moan about Ephraim for that opening scene, and then suddenly they leap to his defense here, purely because they're understanding Aben's behavior through the lens of this sort of simplistic religious orthodoxy that that he very directly wishes death on his father, and they identify, because they're little sheep, that that's not righteous. They don't think about why that's the case, or if they've got something in common with Aben, they just simply identify that it's heretical or morally wrong according to sort of the theological tenets that they've been brought up to respect. And then Aben violently says, he is not my dad. He's not my father, even though he is. This violent Oedipal hostility is evident from the word go, and he violently says, he's not mine. He denies his own genetic connection to his actual father, and this is an important feature of this play. He loathes half of himself, and that's where his own sort of dramatic conflict comes from. He loathes half of his identity, and it is a part of his identity that is present in the play. His vengeful, resentful desire to control the farm, and his hostility to anything that gets in the way of it is his dad. And that's one of the great ironies of the play, is that he's so consciously connected to his mother that he doesn't realize the elements of his character that he shares in common with his own father. They dryly say, you'd not let no one else say that about your ma. I just can't do this accent. It just hurts me too much inside. He gives one abrupt sardonic guffaw, and Peter grins. So there is an awareness of the intensity of his maternal connection, and they sort of seem to be poking fun at him here, like they think they're having a joke on his behalf. And he is very pale. So there is this sense of disturbance, I think, that they create in him here. But he says, I hain't his'n, and I hain't like him. He ain't me. He denies the blood connection between the two of them. I ain't his. I ain't like him. He ain't me. There's a sort of, from a logical perspective, the only thing that is incorrect there is that when he says, I ain't his, he is by blood. He is his son. But just because he's not like him and he isn't him, the logic of those phrases is, self-evident. It's like, well, yeah, you're a different human being. But these are the grounds on which he's making his claim for disconnecting himself from his paternal line. Is he's not like me, and I ain't like him. We're different from each other. And of course, there is an element of truth to this. But again, that's that central dramatic irony that he doesn't realize that he's more like him than he thinks he is. And so this is an important part. And I think it's also partly what connects him to Blanche as well. She constantly fails to fully understand aspects of her own character, and in a way that the audience is given access to his character. And also Stanley. Stanley doesn't realize the limitations of his own vision of reality in Streetcar. He doesn't realize that his materialistic vision of life is completely limited. And then Aben intensely says, I'm Ma, every drop of blood. So he has this full conscious identification with maternity and the natural Dionysian vitality that it represents. Here is where he makes this very explicit claim for his identity being resident within his connection to his mother and the female, feminized vitality that she represents, and therefore the elms as the symbol. So that's where his sort of sense of conflict with his father comes from. We'll stop there.